This is week 3 of our Lenten study, looking at children in both the Hebrew and the Christian scriptures. Um, this is the week we're going to look at some of the boys in the Hebrew scripture, which arguably are greater in number. But as we get into looking at them, we run up against history. Now, it's been assumed for, well, ever, I guess, that the Bible is historically true, starting from Adam and Eve and moving on forward. Now, there's a lot of science that will dispute it, there's a lot of history that will dispute it, but common assumption in our society is that the Bible has a lot of history in it. Now, that's true, but it is not full of history. There is a lot of stories in it that cannot be proven. And really, as we're looking at something from a historical perspective, we're talking about additional sources of information that will provide it for us, or looking at the story that's not embellished. Because one of the really good ways to figure out whether a story is more historically true or not is the level of embellishment. So when you're looking at Genesis and Exodus, and you're looking at the stories of Moses and Jacob, Noah, all of those folks, there's a lot of embellishment in the stories. What they think, what they do, what their name means when they're given it, their actions. They're all bigger than life heroes. When you get to the Christian scriptures, you don't get that level of additional uh, information about the characters. You get their names, maybe where they're from, maybe their connection with Jesus, but beyond that, you don't get much. That kind of tells us as historians that they are actual historical people, whereas people in the earliest parts of the Hebrew scriptures, they could be, or they could be amalgamations of several, or they could just be really great stories. We don't know. So when we're encountering anybody in the Hebrew scriptures, we always have to have that literal versus literary tension going on. And one cannot be sacrificed for the other because story has truth. Story has its own meaning that is profound and we cannot dismiss it. So when we're looking at the boys who are in leadership, we have to kind of balance those two worlds against each other. In fact, the boys that we're looking at today, the only two who have any historical evidence that they existed are David and King Josiah. And even King Josiah's information or validation is actually secondhand. It's actually one of his servants who we have evidence for, not Josiah itself. So we're going to go through 5 boys. This week we're looking at David and Samuel and Moses and Josiah and Daniel, and looking at these boys who became leaders. Of course, there's many, many more boys mentioned, but specifically boys who became great leaders in the Hebrew culture is what we're focusing on today. So first off, it's Moses. Now, we looked at Moses' story last week and we're looking at Miriam because most of Moses' story actually is Miriam's story. But when you look at the story of Moses, just him, the very first thing we're told is that he is from the house of Levi. Now, Christians that doesn't probably mean very much to us, but for Jewish people, it means a lot because the house of Levi was the only house of all the 12 tribes of Jacob that did not have a parcel of land. You can you can go to Google at any point in time and look at the 12 tribes of Israel, and you'll find this wonderful map outlining where everything was. Now, historically, we can't prove that it even existed that way, that these lands were even there. But narratively, these are traditional lands of various tribes. Now, Joseph, his 2 sons, are the ones that are given the land. That's how you get up to the number 12. Levi is never given land. Levi has a couple of cities, including Jerusalem. And the whole idea of the Levites is that they're the priestly group. So they're the family that basically populates everybody with their priestly stuff. So right away, we understand that Moses was born in the priestly class, in the priestly group of people, highly respected out of all the tribes. They were the ones that, of course, were the people who helped with ritual and worship. So Moses has that pedigree. Now, he's not raised in it, but that is his pedigree. And that is very significant for why he is respected as we go forward, in addition to all the wondrous things that he does. So Moses is a child. Really, the only thing we hear about is that he is in the basket. He's plucked out of the basket by the daughter of the Pharaoh. He manages to survive thanks to his mother and sister, and probably the midwives Shiphrah and Puah, or I mean, there are other midwives, I'm sure, but the whole world that Moses is built into is designed to thwart the Pharaoh's dictate that all baby boys should be killed. The midwives won't do it, and they give an excuse to the Pharaoh. And, a man would not have been part of birth. He wouldn't have known anything about it, especially a man of his caliber. He wouldn't even have been around for the birth of animals. So he seems to buy the midwife's excuse that the Hebrew women have their children so fast that they can't get in there and do anything about it, trying to get themselves off the hook from essentially being murderers of these Hebrew boys. Moses is saved after 3 months, put in the basket. Then he's plucked from the river by the Pharaoh's daughter, raised as the adopted child of the Pharaoh's daughter. We have no knowledge of any more family that she has, but she protects him. And somehow, being raised in the palace of the Pharaoh, he gets the sensibility of fairness. And he is quite upset with what happens to the Hebrew people. He was found in a blanket that was obviously from the Hebrews. Now, whether or not he knew that was his heritage or not, some say yes, some say no. But he instinctively looked at the problems that were going on with the Hebrew people, and he wanted to step up, make a difference. Ended up killing one of the Egyptian guards. And when the Pharaoh found out about that, he decided that Moses had to go, because Moses had no real link to him, not biologically, probably not emotionally. And Moses then leaves. So the childhood of Moses is incredibly abbreviated, but it sets him up for everything that is about to happen and all the story he is part of as he goes forward in the rescuing of the Hebrew people, the plagues, the Ten Commandments, everything that he now comes with is because as a child he is recognized as someone very, very significant and worthy of being saved, essentially. So the next person we're going to look at is Samuel. Now, he's a really interesting character. He's known as the king maker, but never a king. However, he was one of the greatest leaders that the ancient Hebrews had. They looked to him for everything. And the story that we know best about Samuel is when he's in the temple and he hears his name being called, and his guardian Eli responds that I didn't call you. Now, the reason he's in the temple is because when he was roughly 4, his mother gave him back to the temple. Hannah, his mother, is one of a long line of women we meet in the Bible who are the favored wives, but they haven't had children of their own. So through great prayer, eventually they managed to conceive. Now, Hannah made a bargain with God and said that if you give me a child, then I will give him back to service in God's house. Now, this is before Jerusalem and the temple are created. So the Ark of the Covenant at this point in time, so that's a big case, really, that holds the broken tablets when Moses threw down the Ten Commandments. That ark was traveling with the Hebrew people, and they rested it at a place called Shiloh. There would be a large tent. There wouldn't be buildings necessarily for the worship, but there'd be a large tent. And because the early Hebrew tradition was a pilgrimage tradition, people would come annually to make their sacrifices, make their offerings to God at Shiloh. Eli was the head priest there, and he encounters Hannah. He thinks Hannah's drunk because she is praying without saying words out loud. And she says, no, I'm not. I'm praying for something. I'm praying for really, really hard. And Eli says, that level of dedication, you're going to get what you expect. Hannah goes back home, and indeed, she has the child Samuel. Then it says that she brings him to the temple after he's weaned. Now, at that day and age, I mean, we're used to breastfeeding now as something that may go on for 6 months, maybe a year. It's really, really rare that it happens beyond or up to 2 years. At that time, nutrition was very difficult for babies. So women nursed for a lot longer than they do today. Chances are that we're talking about a 3, 4-year-old child, maybe even 5, but I think that's pushing it. But a small child, essentially. Hannah takes him to Eli and gives him to Eli and says, I promise to give my child back to God. So here he is. She comes every year, brings him new clothes, brings him stuff. Eventually, she's got more children of her own. So she doesn't necessarily abandon Samuel at Shiloh, but she leaves him behind. He's raised by Eli. And then we get the story where he is going into where Samuel hears the voice, and he goes to ask Eli. And 3 times this happens, and Eli says, I didn't call you. The 3rd time, Eli says, oh, wait a minute. Okay, I think I know what's going on. And then he tells Samuel to go back and listen and say, I'm here, because he's been hearing the word of God. So the 4th time Samuel hears the voice, instead of going to Eli, he actually does say, okay, God, I'm here. What do you have to tell me? And that's when God says that he's going to destroy Eli and his sons because they have not been doing their job. And Eli has been overlooking it, dismissing it, turning a blind eye to what's going on, even though God said you better go in and correct your sons. Eli just didn't. So Eli is included in the message of destruction. Samuel, of course, does not want to tell Eli this is coming down the pike. But when Eli asks him and pushes for it, he eventually does tell Eli what God had said. And Eli just accepts it. Like, God is fair. That's what's going to happen. So that's the story of Samuel. He now grows up to be a great leader, as I said, the kingmaker. He's responsible for the first 2 kings of the Hebrew people. Now, he also tries to talk the Hebrew people out of wanting a king. And he goes through this whole process of, you realize if you have a king, you have to give up some of your land because it'll become the king's land. You have to suddenly be part of the army because it'll be the king's army and you're expected to do things. But the people still require it. Samuel takes it to God and God says, yep, give them their king. So the first one that Samuel finds is Saul. Saul's a king for a while, and then he kind of falls away. He doesn't do what he's supposed to do. And between Samuel and God's conversation, it's decided that Saul is to be removed. And Samuel now has to go find the next king. And this is when we meet the great King David. Now, David is known as the greatest king the Hebrews have ever had. In fact, in the Christian scriptures and in further Christian writing, there's always this assumption of getting back to the kingdom of David. That is supposed to be grand, all-encompassing, united, everybody's getting along in this big, happy world of Hebrew love. History probably doesn't prove that that's the reality. Now, we do have evidence that David existed. In 1993, there was a tablet discovered, or not a tablet, but a brick wall, a large slab of brick that was found in northern Israel, I believe. And when they turned it over, they saw an engraving, an inscription for the House of David. And they dated it back to about 1100 to 960 BCE. That is the only physical evidence we have, extra biblical evidence we have of David existing. And rather than having the entirety of Israel and Judah as a kingdom, he probably had something that was maybe just the northern kingdom, what became known as Israel. And he could have been a Bedouin. That's one of the theories that is around, that he was a Bedouin leader who had amassed great wealth and he was highly respected. Could be the king we hear about in scripture, this great king where many, many tales are told of. We don't know, so we can't dismiss either option. David, as a child, it probably has the most of his childhood recorded. We start off first, of course, with Samuel going to Jesse, as God told him, to go find the next king. And Jesse goes through his first 7 sons, and Samuel says, none of them. God doesn't pick any of them. Do you have any more sons? And of course he calls David, who's a child, out taking care of the sheep. As a child, he would have been dismissed completely. But because Samuel is there on God's mission, Jesse brings him in. And as soon as David arrives, Jesse says, okay, this is the one who's going to be king. From there, we have the story of David being in the house of Saul. Now, Saul at this point has no idea that David is going to be the next king. And it says in the scripture that the spirit of the Lord has been taken away from Saul, and a spirit of evil has been placed on him. And when he is in despair under the control of the spirit of evil, the only thing calms him is David playing the harp. So there is interaction between David and Saul when David is a child. The next story we have, of course, is the very well-known story of David and Goliath, where David is sent as a young teenager, probably 12, 13 by this point in time, old enough to be trusted with traveling over great distances, too young to be included in the battling Israelites. So he's sent to where the battle is between the Israelites and the Philistines, where three of his older brothers are fighting. And he comes upon them and looks around and wonders, why are you all sitting here? What's going on? And while he's there, the daily visit of Goliath from the Philistine camp comes, and Goliath is called a giant. And he insults and annoys and tempts the Israel people. And the brothers and everybody else basically say to David, see, that's why we're not doing anything. David's not having any of that. So David tells the leader that he's going to go and do something about it. He can get rid of the wolves when they're after the sheep, so he can definitely get rid of this guy. No one really believes he can do that. The leader's like, yeah, well, whatever, you go do your thing. Of course, Jesse and David's brothers are very, very upset that David would even try to do this. To protect David, they give him armor, which is way too big and way too heavy for him. So he says, no, I can't wear this. I've just got to go and do my thing. So he goes out, and when Goliath comes out to challenge him, David tells Goliath in no uncertain terms that God's on David's side and they're going to win. Well, Goliath gets annoyed. David picks up a rock, puts it in a slingshot, whips it around, and throws it, hits Goliath right in the forehead. And of course, Goliath falls over, and he's dead. The Philistines are completely shocked because he was their only real warrior, apparently. They run away. Israel wins the day, plunders whatever the Philistines left. David is, again, the hero of the Hebrew people. These things keep mounting up until he does actually become named king. So Saul is so impressed by this that he invites David, now a bit of an older teenager, to come into his own, I'm not even sure what you would call it, basically being surrounding him, one of his advisors, one of the people, part of his court, essentially. And it's at this time that David and Jonathan, Saul's oldest son, become friends. Now, it would be normal to expect that Jonathan would inherit from Saul, but the God has already taken the kingship away from Saul and will be giving it to David. There is a lot of ink spilled about the relationship between David and Jonathan. There is suggestion of it being an incredible love match. There is all sorts of insistences that they're only really, really good friends. Again, who knows what's going on? For people who identify as queer, this is the first gay couple that they're finding in the Bible. This is the first example of mutual positive homosexual love in the Bible. And we can't dismiss it as not being that. We just can't be assured that it is. But this is the story of David as a child, incredibly full. And he will eventually rise to be the greatest king that the Hebrew people have ever known. Now, speaking of kings, the next boy we're going to look at is the boy named Josiah. He, at this point in time, is the king of Judah. Now, I want to stop for a second here. Between David and Josiah, there is a break apart of the northern and the southern tribes. So the 10 tribes of the north that form Israel, and the 2 tribes in the south that form Judah. And they are, I believe, Judah and Benjamin. And then the other tribes are considered in the north. That is the line that Jesus will be passing back and forth when he is moving back and forth between Galilee and Jerusalem. That he will be crossing the line between the northern tribes, where the northern tribes used to be. They're also known as the lost tribes. And then the southern tribes of essentially Judah. That was the big one, and that Jerusalem is physically in the tribe of the land of Judah. Now, again, This land is apocryphal. It is not necessarily how maps were designed and drawn, but it's the identity that the Hebrew people hold on to. And even when we get into the Christian scriptures, we see Paul identifying with his Hebrew background. So it's very significant for these people. And when we get to looking at the true history books in the Bible, we're actually only looking at a handful. And they are books that are written by both the northern and the southern tribes. Now, how that went on is that when the Assyrians invaded the northern part, the Israeli tribes, they, of course, took everybody off the land. They brought their own people in the land. The mix of Hebrew people and Assyrians were basically the forefathers of the Samaritans. So that's why the people in Judah have never thought the Samaritans were legitimate Hebrew people, and why the Samaritans always thought the Judeans were full of bunk, because they identify as being from the tribes of of Jacob. The books that were written by the northern tribes, so they're identified as 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. Now, when the Assyrians took people off the land, a number of the intelligentsia, of the learneds, the priests in the northern kingdom, ran off to the southern kingdom. And they were writing their historical truths in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. So they have a perspective of the northern tribe. The southern tribes of Judah, their historical book is 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So this is why you're going to have an overlap in the stories and the names between Kings and Chronicles for sure. Samuel talks about people before the takeover of the Assyrians and before the actions of what goes on in Kings. So Samuel's where you're going to find, of course, Samuel and David, Jonathan, all that crew. The southern tribe, their historical books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles are followed up by Ezra and Nehemiah, that are sometimes considered one book and sometimes considered two. And they are the ones that talk about the return of the Hebrew people from exile in Babylon. So there's an incredible historical stretch that these books cover. One of the reasons we identify them as the true historical books of the Hebrew scriptures is because they name a lot of people who are actually able to be verified extra biblically, which means outside. There are temples to them. They are palaces. There are acknowledgments that they are the leaders of their own territories, be it Babylon or Persia or Syria. There's a whole host of them that are identified. So we look at these books to be a little more accurate in the history of what's going on. And they generally cover the history leading up to the Syrian occupation and leading away from the Babylonian exile. So that we've got that whole period of the Assyrian and the Babylonian exiles not well documented in the Hebrew scriptures, acknowledged but not well documented. So we get to King Josiah. Now he is, as I said, he along with David are the two only ones that have any extra biblical evidence that they exist. How we know Josiah probably existed is his servant Isaiah had a stamp that he used. It's called the what's it called? Sorry, I've got my notes here. I did not put it down. So it's basically the seal of Isaiah. And that was found quite some time ago. I'm not exactly sure what. But it was the stamp he would have put on melted wax or something, or clay, he would have put on to seal a document or to recognize that this document is authentic. Now, for someone to have a seal, they probably were literate, which meant they could write. Just about everybody in the Hebrew culture had access to reading some of the Hebrew scriptures. But writing and reading were not taught together at the same time. So the fact that Isaiah had a seal meant he probably was a scribe. So he was probably the scribe for Josiah. We don't have any direct historical link, but scholars basically agree that he was the one who helped Isaiah, because it's both Josiah's time and Isaiah's seal both come from the mid 7th century BCE. So the overlap cannot be just consequential. So what we know about Josiah, he was a boy king. We read about him in both Kings and Chronicles, and he came to the throne because his father, Ammon, before him, and his grandfather and before a couple of generations before, turned away from God, and they started welcoming in the Canaanite gods of Baal, and there's history of a Asherah that has a multiple forked history. We can't really follow where Asherah came from, but it talks about Josiah getting rid of anything to do with these two gods that the Israel people had now been worshiping. And his father Ammon was assassinated by his own servants because they were just so disgusted by the fact that he had turned against the Hebrew gods. So Josiah at 8 was already dedicating himself to the true God, the Hebrew God. By the time he was 16, he managed to destroy all of the, or started rather, to destroy all of the evidence of Baal and Asherah and any other idolatrous worship. So getting rid of shrines, getting rid of what's called the pole of Asherah, could have been a dancing place, kind of like the maypole, I don't know. Anything to do with these worshiping of the gods of Canaan, and getting rid of it all through his land. Now, Josiah was definitely the king of Judah, so the southern tribes. He is not part of the group that goes to exile in Babylon. So they believe that they have a special grace about them, and a special relationship with God, that they have been saved. So as Josiah gets older, he puts more and more money into restoring the temple, and now this is the first temple, not the second temple, putting money into worship and having everybody refocus what their Hebrew worship is going to be on, making sure it's the true God. So in several years later, 18 years into his reign, they discover a scroll of the law, probably the scroll that came from written by Moses. That's the tradition that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, of course, and he is the giver of the laws to the Hebrew people. Well, Josiah takes this as a horrible omen, and he is wrecked that this happens. So he sends 5 of his advisors, including this servant Asaiah, to a prophet named Huldah, and she gives Josiah the message that because the Israeli people have been so horrid in their actual worship of God and followed the idols, that they're going to be destroyed. But it will not happen until after Josiah's reign is over, after he's dead. So he's not going to actually see it. Now, most scholars, biblical scholars and historians, identify that as a prophecy of the exile to Babylon. So all of this would have been written while the priestly class was in exile in Babylon. So they would have had the experience, but they're writing back into time King Josiah, who hadn't the experience yet, and saying that the prediction of their destruction was imminent. And that's a legacy that Josiah continues on. But as a child, he did everything he could to bring the people back to God, to put them in a far better relationship with God than the men in his family had in previous reigns. Finally, we're going to look at Daniel. Now, Daniel, like Esther, is considered one of the novels in the Bible. Again, like I said last week, the novels are Esther, Ruth, Daniel, Job, and Jonah. Daniel is written in what's called the apocalyptic literature tradition. It was a tradition that went on or a style rather, a genre that went on for about 300, maybe 400 years. It was well after the exile in Babylon was over, well into the reign of the Persians, and extended into the reign of the control of the Romans. So we also have the Book of Revelations that is written in this style, and essentially apocalyptic literature is telling the people, yeah, it's awful now, no doubt, but God's at work, and it will get better, and you will be led out, that God will make sure that all of your enemies are punished, and you'll be fine. You just have to hold on and wait. That's essentially the message of apocalyptic literature. I have a hard time with that word. Daniel is in that vein as well. But when we're looking at Daniel as a young person, we're looking at the first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel, where he and 3 of his friends are from the royal household of Israel, of Judah, and they're in exile because when the Judeans were taken off, it was just the wealthy and the political that were taken off. The average Judeans were left behind, different from the Assyrian exile where they took everybody. So these boys came from, these teenagers essentially came from the royal house in Judah. And they were picked because they were already very well educated. And King Nebuchadnezzar, his dates were about early 6th century BCE. He wanted some of the boys, the Hebrew boys, to be able to speak and write in their language of Babylon, which would have been Accadia. Now, this is not to be mistaken for the French Acadians in the Maritimes of Canada in the 17 and 1800s. This is spelled Akkadia. These boys were brought in to learn this lesson, and Daniel's companions became better known by the Babylonian names they were given: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were the 3 that eventually would be in the fiery furnace, but they wouldn't burn up. But that's a different story that we're not going to cover. Daniel was given a Babylonian name too, but we just never see it being used. So Daniel was, as they got older, they basically annoyed the leadership, because Daniel particularly would not disobey the Hebrew rules, the Hebrew food laws, prayer laws, any of those. He was very, very strict adherent to his Hebrew tradition, his Hebrew faith. So he got in trouble a lot, and he was punished by the people he was working with considerably. But in every turn, he was shown to be healthier and stronger and wiser than anybody else, regardless of how they tried to contain him and make him worse off, health-wise. And then eventually he finds out. So King Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and none of the wise men can figure it out. And this is small w. We're not talking about the magi that will come with Jesus. These are wise men. These are the advisors, the interpreters of dreams around Nebuchadnezzar. Because in ancient times, dreams were considered very, very prophetic, especially if you had a really weird or interesting dream. They believed the gods were trying to give you a message. So in this dream, Nebuchadnezzar was quite distressed, and he asked his wise men what it meant. None of them could answer. And he was so angry that he decided to kill all of them. Daniel got wind of this and went to the close servants of the king and said, can you just hold him off for a minute? Give me a little bit of time to pray on this, and I'll come back with an answer for the king. So they were able to kind of calm down Nebuchadnezzar for a while. Daniel came back, gave him interpretation of the dream. Nebuchadnezzar was satisfied with that, brought Daniel into his household as one of his wise men, one of his advisors, and David brought his friends into the household as well. So they were all very well placed in the Hebrew household. Now we have an experience where we go from Nebuchadnezzar to his son to the Persian king Darius. And you can't really do that math for years, because that would have made Daniel a very, very old person, but that's not how the story depicts him. So in the household of Darius, so this is now when the Persians have taken over Babylon, and the Persians essentially let the Hebrew people go back to Judah and go back to settle, and they're the ones that give the Hebrews money to restore the temple, essentially to build the second temple. And this is where the story is going to be picked up in Ezra and Nehemiah. That's where you're going to get some of the history of that. So while they are rebuilding the temple, the book of Daniel is being written or theoretically taking place. King Darius, known as Darius the Great, so his dates were late 6th century to early 5th century, BCE. So he has his own issues, and he is convinced by his advisors that all the Hebrew people need to be destroyed. Now, this is very much in parallel with Esther's story. Darius just goes along with it, doesn't realize one of his favorite advisors, Daniel, falls in that category. And again, trying to get rid of Daniel because of jealousy, the same way they tried to get rid of Mordechai because of jealousy in the story of Esther. So Daniel is sent to a lion's pit because he will not worship Darius as king. Darius doesn't realize until later that he's been set up. So he worries about Daniel the entire night through, and then goes to the pit the next morning, and there finds Daniel perfectly alive, lions lying around him, quite content. Darius decides that anybody who was trying to destroy Daniel, they're just going to throw them and their families in the pit. It gets really gross. We're not going to cover that too much. But Daniel essentially is known as the one who is constant in, no matter what he is facing by the Babylonians, by the Persians, by anybody else, he is constantly a follower of God. Makes him one of the great leaders, great prophets of the Hebrew people, and shows them that they can live constantly in following the rules, that you don't have to disobey the rules of God in order to survive and thrive in whatever world we're working in. And that is a message that is very much needed when eventually the Hebrew people become kicked out of Judah and eventually become the diaspora that will eventually become the Jewish folks. So that idea that Daniel showed them is very primal. So these are 5 of the boys that became great leaders, very significant in the telling of the Hebrew story. Next week, we're going to look at Jesus as a child and a couple of my pet peeves around why we don't know much about that. So thank you for being part of this, and I hope to see you next week when we look at Jesus' childhood.